On one of the darkest nights that little town had ever seen, the wind screamed through the trees like a warning. Rain fell so hard that even the lanterns carried by the search teams barely pierced the darkness. Somewhere out there, an 8-year-old boy had vanished. Hundreds of volunteers searched the forests. Dogs tracked his scent. The river was dragged for days. The newspapers called it one of the most heartbreaking disappearances in the region. Weeks became months. Months became years. Eventually, everyone accepted the same painful conclusion. The boy had died during the storm. His parents never moved away. Every evening, his mother still looked through the living room window whenever thunder rolled across the valley, not because she expected a miracle, but because hope is often a lasting grief allows us to surrender. Then, years later, a young man appeared at the edge of town. His clothes were worn. His face carried the marks of a difficult life. He walked straight toward the old house where nobody had lived happily since the night of the storm. When the elderly woman opened the door, she froze. She looked into his eyes and whispered only 4 words. I know those eyes. The impossible had happened, but where had he been all those years? Why had he never tried to return? And what terrible secret had kept him away for so long? Because the truth behind this forgotten case was far stranger than anyone had ever imagined. History remembers great wars, great kings, great discoveries. But history often forgets ordinary people whose lives were forever changed by extraordinary events. Sometimes, the greatest mysteries were never meant to become famous. They simply happened to families who spent the rest of their lives searching for answers that never came. Today's story is one of those forgotten tragedies. It begins in a quiet American town where everyone believed they knew one another, a place where children still played until sunset, where neighbors left pies on each other's porches, where nothing truly terrible had happened in decades, until one violent storm erased a little boy without leaving behind a single explanation. Search teams crossed forests. Divers searched rivers. Volunteers refused to give up. Yet the years continued to pass. The missing posters slowly disappeared. The newspapers stopped writing. The world moved on. Only one family never did. Because sometimes hope survives much longer than certainty. And sometimes the truth waits patiently for years before finally returning home. This is the story of a disappearance that history almost forgot, and of the impossible return that nobody believed could ever happen. Spring returned to the valley almost a year after Daniel disappeared. Wildflowers once again covered the hillsides. Children filled the school playground with laughter. The creek, now calm and peaceful, looked nothing like the raging torrent that had terrified the town months earlier. Nature had healed. People had begun healing too. At least, that was how it appeared from the outside. For Daniel's parents, however, time had stopped on the night of the storm. Inside their home, almost nothing had changed. His small bedroom remained exactly as he had left it. His favorite book still rested neatly beside the bed. A pair of muddy boots remained near the closet door. His baseball glove waited on the bedroom shelf, untouched. Every Saturday morning, his mother opened the curtains. Every evening, she closed them again, as if Daniel might return at any moment and complain that his room had become too dark. Friends gently suggested it might help to pack away some of his belongings. She refused. Doing so felt too much like saying goodbye, and she wasn't ready for that. His father buried himself in work. He repaired fences, fixed tractors, volunteered for every difficult task around the farm. Anything that kept his hands busy, anything that stopped his mind from imagining what might have happened that terrible night. Yet even while working, he constantly listened. Sometimes he thought he heard footsteps outside. Sometimes he imagined hearing Daniel call from across the fields. Every time, it was only the wind. The sheriff never officially closed the investigation. New information continued arriving from time to time. Someone believed they had seen a young boy living with a traveling family. Another witness reported seeing a frightened child at a roadside diner hundreds of miles away. Investigators followed every lead. Each one ended in disappointment. The missing posters slowly faded beneath rain and sunlight. Corners peeled away. Ink disappeared. Faces became almost impossible to recognize. Eventually, Volunteers replaced them with newer posters. Then those faded too. Years passed. New children were born in town. Families moved away. Old neighbors passed on. The story slowly transformed into local folklore. Parents use it as a warning. Don't wander too far. Come home before dark. Storms can change everything. Children who had never met Daniel knew his name, but only as part of a story, not as a real little boy who had once laughed beside them. His parents hated hearing strangers speak about him that way. To everyone else, Daniel had become history. To them, he was still their son. One quiet evening, almost 6 years after the disappearance, Daniel's mother walked a mailbox. Inside, she found another anonymous letter. It contained only a single sentence. "I think I saw your son." No return address, no signature, no explanation. Most people would have thrown it away. She didn't. She carefully folded the paper, placed it inside a wooden box filled with every letter, every newspaper clipping, every search map, every photograph, and every tiny piece of hope collected over the years. She whispered the same words she had spoken almost every night since the storm. "I know you're still alive." The rest of the world had stopped believing. She never did. And somewhere, far beyond that quiet valley, a young man carried memories he could never fully explain. Memories that began with thunder and ended in silence. More than 11 years had passed since the night of the storm. The valley had changed. The old grocery store had become a pharmacy. The train station had closed. Several farms had been sold to new families who had never heard the full story of the missing boy. Life, as it always does, had continued. Daniel would now be 19 years old. At least, that was the age his parents imagined whenever they looked at his childhood photographs. His mother often wondered how tall he might have become. Would he have inherited his father's broad shoulders? Would he still smile the same way? Would she even recognize him after so many years? Those questions never had answers. Not then. Hundreds of miles away, another young man was asking very different questions. He had no childhood photographs, no birth certificate, no family album, no clear memories of where he had come from. The people who had raised him called him David. They insisted they had found him wandering alone after a terrible storm many years earlier. He remembered almost nothing before that, only fragments, a loud clap of thunder, cold rain, running, someone shouting his name, then darkness. For years he accepted that explanation. Children often trusted the adults around them, especially when they had no memories to challenge the story. But as David grew older, small details began disturbing him. He noticed he looked nothing like the people who claimed to be his relatives. He had different eyes, different hair, different habits. Whenever he asked about his early childhood, the answers were always brief, always uncomfortable. His questions changed the mood inside the house. Eventually, everyone told him the same thing. The past doesn't matter, but to David, it mattered more every year. Sometimes he dreamed about places he had never visited, a white wooden fence, a creek flowing behind a small house, an old oak tree with a swing hanging from one branch. When he woke, the images disappeared almost immediately, yet they always returned, again and again. One afternoon, while cleaning an old storage shed behind the property, David discovered a rusted metal box hidden beneath loose floorboards. Inside were faded newspaper clippings. Most were too damaged to read, but one photograph immediately caught his attention. It showed a smiling little boy. Beneath the picture were large printed words. Missing. The paper had become yellow with age. Rain stains covered part of the page. Only one name remained readable. Daniel. David stared at the photograph for several minutes. Something deep inside him stirred. Not recognition, not certainty, just an impossible feeling that he had seen those eyes before. He quietly folded the newspaper and placed it inside his jacket. That night, for the first time in his life, he began wondering whether the story he had always been told was actually true. And somewhere beyond memory, the storm that had stolen his childhood slowly began returning to him. David said nothing about the newspaper clipping. Not at first. He carefully hid it beneath the thin mattress in his small bedroom and returned to his daily routine as though nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The photograph of the missing boy refused to leave his mind. Every evening, after everyone else had gone to sleep, he unfolded the fragile newspaper once more. The smiling child looked strangely familiar, not because he remembered the face, but because somehow it felt connected to him. The article was badly damaged. Rain and time had erased most of the words. Only scattered sentences remained. Missing after, violent storm, search continues, parents' refuse, and beneath the photograph, one name, Daniel Harper. David repeated it quietly. Daniel. The name echoed inside him with an unexpected sense of comfort, almost like hearing a melody he had forgotten years before. The following morning, he decided to ask another question, not directly, casually, during breakfast. He looked toward the older man who had raised him. How old was I when you found me? The man hesitated, only for a second, but David noticed. You were about 8. Exactly the same age as the missing boy in the newspaper. David remained silent. Later that afternoon, he asked another question. Where did you find me? Again, a pause. Near a highway. Which highway? I don't remember. It was the first answer that had never made sense. How could someone forget the place where they supposedly found a lost child? Over the following weeks, David began noticing things he had ignored for years. There were no family photographs of him as a small child, none before the age of 8, no birthday celebrations, no school records from his early years. Nothing. It was as though his life had begun suddenly in the middle of childhood. One evening, unable to control his curiosity any longer, he visited the small public library in the nearest town. The librarian, an elderly woman with silver hair and thick glasses, smiled warmly as he approached. I'm looking for old newspapers. She nodded. What year? David unfolded the damaged clipping. I don't know exactly, but I have this. She adjusted her glasses and carefully examined the fragile paper. Her expression slowly changed. I remember this case. David looked up. You do? Oh, yes. The entire country seemed to talk about that little boy. He disappeared during one of the worst storms we ever had. They searched for months. She walked to a row of large archive cabinets. After several minutes, she returned carrying thick volumes of preserved newspapers, carefully turning the brittle pages. She finally stopped. There. David looked down. The same smiling photograph stared back at him. Only now, the newspaper was complete. He began reading every word. Daniel Harper, 8 years old, brown hair, gray-blue eyes, small scar above his left eyebrow. David instinctively raised his hand to his forehead. Hidden beneath his hair, a thin scar crossed exactly the same place. His breathing became heavier. The article continued. Daniel had disappeared during a violent storm while walking home near Miller's Creek, despite one of the largest searches in county history. No trace of him had ever been found. David's hands began trembling. For years he had believed he had no past. Now, for the first time, he was staring directly at one. The librarian watched him carefully. Are you all right? David couldn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on one sentence printed near the bottom of the page. His parents never stopped believing he was alive. Those words struck him harder than anything else he had read, because somewhere deep inside, a feeling he had never understood suddenly became impossible to ignore. For the first time in his life, he wondered whether someone, somewhere, had been waiting for him all along. Most people believed the case had ended years earlier. The newspapers certainly did. Television stations had long since stopped mentioning Daniel Harper's name. The boxes containing the investigation had been moved from an active desk to an old archive room inside the county sheriff's office. Dust slowly settled across forgotten files, one after another. But one man had never completely let go. Retired Sheriff Thomas Whitaker still thought about the case every time a summer storm rolled across the valley. He had investigated murders, bank robberies, farm accidents, disappearances. Yet none had haunted him like the little boy who had vanished without leaving behind a single believable explanation. For years, he had replayed that night inside his mind. Every decision, every search route, Every witness statement, every possibility. He often asked himself the same painful question: what did we miss? One rainy afternoon, more than a decade after Daniel disappeared, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. The county clerk handed him a small envelope that had arrived without a return address. Inside was nothing more than a photocopy of an old newspaper article. Daniel's photograph. Someone had circled the image with a red pen. Below it, written in shaky handwriting, were 5 simple words. Look at him again. No signature. No explanation. No clue as to who had mailed it. Thomas stared at the photograph for several minutes. He had seen it hundreds of times before. Yet this time, something felt different. He unlocked the old evidence room. Cardboard boxes lined the shelves from floor to ceiling. Near the back sat a faded container marked simply, Harper, 1987. He carefully removed the lid. Inside were hundreds of pages. Volunteer maps, weather reports, search logs, witness interviews, photographs, objects recovered during the search. Daniel's small backpack, his flashlight, his notebook, everything had remained untouched for years. Thomas spent hours reading documents he already knew almost by heart. Then he reached something he had nearly forgotten. The original witness statements taken during the first 24 hours. One sentence immediately caught his attention. A farmer had reported seeing an unfamiliar pickup truck parked near Miller's Creek shortly before the storm reached full strength. At the time, investigators believed it had belonged to a fisherman. No one had ever located the vehicle. Thomas frowned. He continued reading. Another witness. A teenage girl delivering newspapers. She remembered seeing the same truck driving away much faster than conditions allowed. Again, nothing had come from the report. Back then, everyone believed the floodwaters had been responsible for Daniel's disappearance. The truck had seemed unimportant. Now, Thomas wasn't so sure. He spread several maps across his kitchen table that evening. The creek, the roads, the weather timeline, witness locations. For the first time in years, he stopped asking how Daniel had disappeared. Instead, he asked a completely different question. What if Daniel had never been lost? What if someone had taken him before the storm reached its worst? The possibility sent a chill through him. It explained something that had never made sense. Despite one of the largest searches in county history, no trace of the boy had ever been found. No clothing, no remains, no evidence carried downstream. Nothing, almost as if he had never been in the forest after all. Thomas leaned back in his chair. Outside, thunder echoed across the valley. The sound immediately carried him back 11 years. He looked once more at Daniel's smiling school photograph. For the first time in a very long time, the retired sheriff no longer believed he was looking at the picture of a dead child. He believed he might be looking at someone who was still alive. David barely slept that night. The newspaper remained open across the small table beside his bed. He read the article again, then again. Every sentence seemed to raise 2 new questions. If the story was true, who was Daniel Harper? And more importantly, who was he? The next morning, he returned to the library. The elderly librarian smiled as she recognized him. I thought you might come back. David nodded. I need to know where this happened. Without hesitation, she disappeared into another room and returned carrying an old county map. She carefully placed one finger over a small valley, Miller's Creek. Then another. That's where the Harper family lived. The distance surprised him. It wasn't thousands of miles away. It wasn't another country. It was only a day's drive, close enough that someone could have traveled there in a single afternoon, close enough to make everything feel frighteningly real. Before leaving, David hesitated. Do you think? He struggled to finish the sentence. The librarian looked kindly into his eyes. You want to ask whether you could be that little boy. He remained silent. She gently closed the newspaper. I don't know, but I do know something else. She leaned forward. Sometimes the hardest journey isn't across the country. It's across the years. Those words stayed with him as he walked back to the small house where he had spent most of his life. For the first time, it no longer felt like home. That evening, the older couple who had raised him noticed something had changed. He spoke less, ate little. His thoughts seemed far away. Finally, the woman asked quietly, "Is something bothering you?" David looked at both of them. He had imagined this conversation 100 different ways. But when the moment finally arrived, only one question came out. Where did I really come from? Silence filled the room. The older man slowly lowered his fork onto the table. "You've been reading things you shouldn't." David's heartbeat quickened. "So there's something to tell." The man stood. "There are some questions better left unanswered." "No," David replied calmly. "They've already been unanswered for 11 years. Neither of them spoke again. The meal ended in complete silence. Late that night, David packed a small backpack, a few clothes, some money he had saved from working at a local garage, the faded newspaper clipping, and the library map. Just before sunrise, he quietly walked out the front door. He didn't know exactly what he would find. He wasn't even certain he wanted the answers anymore. But one thought refused to leave him. If somewhere, a mother had spent 11 years waiting for her son, he could no longer ignore the possibility that she deserved to know the truth. The old pickup truck he had borrowed rumbled onto the empty highway. Mile after mile disappeared beneath the tires. The farther he drove, the stranger his memories became. Certain places triggered feelings he couldn't explain. A narrow wooden bridge, rows of cornfields, an abandoned grain silo. None of them were familiar, yet none of them felt completely foreign either. As afternoon faded into evening, dark clouds slowly gathered ahead. Thunder echoed across the distant hills. David instinctively tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Without understanding why, storms had always frightened him. Not ordinary fear, something much deeper, something buried inside memories he still couldn't reach. Rain began falling against the windshield. For a brief second, a flash of lightning illuminated the road. And suddenly, he saw it, not outside, inside his mind. A little boy, running, someone shouting, "Daniel!" The image vanished almost immediately. David pulled onto the shoulder of the road, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking. He whispered the name aloud. "Daniel." It no longer sounded like the name of a stranger. It sounded like his own. The rain had stopped by the time David reached the outskirts of the valley. Morning sunlight filtered through the clouds, illuminating the same rolling hills that had once been the backdrop of his earliest memories. Although he couldn't consciously remember the place, something inside him did. Every curve in the road seemed strangely familiar. Every old oak tree stirred an emotion he couldn't explain. The town itself had changed very little. The old church still overlooked the main square. A faded gas station stood beside the highway. The bakery's bell still rang each time customers opened the front door. Life had continued here, quietly, patiently, as though the years had passed without disturbing its rhythm. David parked near the town square. He stepped out of the truck and simply stood there, watching, listening, trying to understand why his heart was racing. An elderly man sitting on a nearby bench looked at him for a moment, then looked again. His expression slowly changed. Not recognition, more like confusion, as though David reminded him of someone he hadn't seen in many years. David lowered his eyes and continued walking. He stopped outside a small cafe. Inside, several older residents were drinking coffee while reading the morning newspaper. Their conversations paused briefly as the stranger entered. The waitress greeted him with a warm smile. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee." She poured a fresh cup. "You passing through?" "I think so." It was an honest answer. He wasn't sure anymore. As she placed a mug on the counter, David quietly unfolded the old newspaper clipping. "I'm looking for this family." The waitress stared at the photograph. Her smile disappeared instantly. She looked back at David, then at the picture, then back at David once more. "You know this boy?" David hesitated. "I don't know." Her voice became softer. "Everyone in this town knows that face." She glanced toward the window. "They still live here." David's heartbeat accelerated. "They do?" She nodded. "They never left." The silence between them felt unusually heavy. After a moment, she reached beneath the counter, pulled out a small notepad, and carefully wrote an address. Willow Road, the last house before the old bridge. She slid the paper across the counter. I don't know why you're looking for them, but... She paused. If this has anything to do with their son... Her eyes became distant. Please be gentle. David folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. Outside, the air felt heavier than before. Each step toward his truck seemed slower, more deliberate. He drove through quiet residential streets lined with maple trees. Children rode bicycles along sidewalks. Families worked in their gardens. Ordinary life unfolded around him until the houses became fewer. The road narrowed, fields open on both sides. Finally, he saw it. A simple white farmhouse standing alone beneath an enormous oak tree. A wooden swing still hung from one thick branch. It moved gently in the afternoon breeze. David stopped breathing. The image struck him like lightning, not because he had seen it moments earlier, because he had dreamed about it for years. The same swing, the same tree, the same fence. Without realizing it, tears filled his eyes. His hands trembled against the steering wheel. Somewhere deep inside his mind, a forgotten door had begun opening. He whispered almost without thinking, I've been here before. The front porch was quiet. Flower pots lined the wooden steps. Wind chimes swayed softly near the entrance. Nothing looked unusual. Nothing looked dramatic. It was simply home, or at least a place that somehow felt more like home than anywhere he had ever lived. David climbed out of the truck. Each footstep across the gravel seemed impossibly loud. He reached the front gate, stopped, looked toward the house. An elderly woman appeared briefly through the living room window. She hadn't noticed him yet. David's heart pounded so hard he could hear it. For 11 years, one family had waited for a miracle, and one young man had searched for a past he couldn't remember. Now, only a single knock on an old wooden door separated them. David slowly raised his hand, then froze, because he suddenly realized something terrifying. What if he wasn't Daniel Harper after all? What if opening that door only destroyed the last hope an aging mother still possessed? His hand remained suspended in the air, unable, or perhaps afraid, to knock. David stood motionless before the old farmhouse. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across the yard. Somewhere nearby, birds sang as though it were just another ordinary day. But nothing about this moment felt ordinary. His hand remained suspended inches from the weathered wooden door. Every instinct urged him to turn around, to return to his truck, to leave before he destroyed whatever fragile piece still existed inside this house. What if he had misunderstood everything? What if the scar, the dreams, the newspaper were only coincidences? He lowered his hand, took one step backward, then another. Just as he reached the front gate, the door slowly opened. An elderly woman stepped onto the porch. Her silver hair was neatly tied behind her head. She wore a faded blue sweater, despite the warm afternoon. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. She simply looked at the young stranger standing beside the gate. David forced a polite smile. I'm sorry. I think I may have the wrong house. The woman continued staring. Something about his voice had caught her attention. She took one cautious step forward. Can I help you? David reached into his jacket and carefully removed the old newspaper clipping. I'm looking for this family. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. The woman accepted it without saying a word. The instant her eyes fell upon the faded photograph, her face lost all color. She wasn't looking at the newspaper anymore. She was looking at David. Slowly, very slowly, her eyes traveled across his face, his hair, his jaw, his posture. Finally, they stopped on the small scar hidden above his left eyebrow. The newspaper slipped from her fingers. It floated gently onto the porch. She whispered almost inaudibly, No. David felt his chest tighten. I don't want to upset you. I only came because... His words disappeared. The elderly woman took another step. Tears had already begun filling her eyes. With trembling hands, she reached toward his face, then stopped only inches away, almost afraid to touch him. as though he might disappear again. Her lips trembled. I know those eyes. David stood perfectly still. He had imagined this meeting 1,000 different ways during the long drive. None had prepared him for this. The front screen door opened again. An older man stepped outside. His shoulders were bent with age. His hands were rough from decades of farm work. He looked first at his wife, then at the stranger. What happened? She couldn't answer. Instead, she slowly pointed toward David. The old man frowned. His eyes narrowed. He studied the young man's face with quiet confusion. Several long seconds passed. Then something changed. He noticed a scar. The same tiny scar his little boy had received after falling from the old oak swing when he was 6 years old. A scar no newspaper had ever clearly shown. His breathing became uneven. He whispered one impossible word. Daniel. The silence that followed seemed to stop time itself. David felt tears filling his own eyes. I don't know. It was the only honest answer he could give. I don't know who I am. The old farmer closed the distance between them. Neither man spoke. Neither knew what to do. Finally, the older man wrapped both arms around the young stranger. He held him tightly, not because he knew with certainty that this was his son, but because after 11 long years, hope had suddenly become stronger than doubt. Inside the house, an old clock continued ticking. Outside, the swing beneath the great oak tree moved gently in the wind, exactly as it had on the afternoon before the storm. For the first time in over a decade, the Harper family allowed themselves to believe that the impossible might actually be standing on their front porch. But proving it would require uncovering a truth far darker than any of them could yet imagine. Word spread through the valley faster than anyone could have imagined. By sunset, neighbors were already gathering quietly along Willow Road. No one wanted to intrude, yet no one could stay away. Some stood beside their cars. Others watched from across the road. Every face carried the same question. Could it really be him? Inside the Harper farmhouse, silence filled the living room. David sat on the edge of an old sofa. Across from him, Margaret Harper couldn't stop looking at him. Every few seconds, she noticed another tiny detail. The way he crossed his hands, the slight tilt of his head when listening, the nervous habit of rubbing his thumb against his fingertips. Little things impossible to describe, yet strangely familiar. Robert Harper finally broke the silence. Can you tell us what you remember? David lowered his eyes. I wish I could. I remember almost nothing before I was about 8. Margaret's breathing became shallow. 8. She whispered the number to herself, exactly the age Daniel had been when he disappeared. David continued carefully. I remember rain, thunder. I remember someone calling a name. He hesitated. I think. He closed his eyes. I think it was Daniel. Margaret covered her mouth. Tears streamed silently down her face. Robert remained composed, at least on the outside. Inside, every word felt like another piece of a puzzle he had spent 11 years trying to solve. David explained everything. The people who had raised him, the newspaper clipping hidden beneath the floorboards, the old librarian, the dreams, the swing, the oak tree, the scar. Nothing was left unsaid. When he finished, no one spoke for almost a full minute. Finally, Margaret stood. Without asking permission, she disappeared down the hallway. She returned carrying a large wooden box. Its corners had become worn with age. She placed it gently on the coffee table. I've kept this ready. Robert looked at the box. You never threw it away. She slowly shook her head. I promised myself that if Daniel ever came home, he would find everything waiting. Inside were dozens of carefully preserved memories, school report cards, birthday cards, drawings made with crayons, a tiny baseball glove, a blue scarf knitted by Margaret the winter before he disappeared. David carefully picked up one drawing. It showed a small house, a large oak tree, a wooden swing. His breathing stopped. I know this. Neither parent moved. I drew this. The words escaped before he even realized he had spoken them. His hands began trembling. Another memory flashed inside his mind. He was sitting beneath the oak tree. His mother was hanging laundry nearby. His father was repairing the fence. Someone laughed. Not just anyone. His mother. The memory vanished almost immediately. David pressed both hands against his forehead. I can almost remember. Margaret knelt beside him. You don't have to force it. We've waited 11 years. We can wait a little longer. Outside, a sheriff's patrol car slowly entered the driveway. Not because anyone suspected a crime, but because retired Sheriff Thomas Whitaker had heard the impossible news. He stepped out carrying a worn leather folder beneath one arm. The same folder he had reopened only days earlier. Inside were witness statements, forgotten reports, and one overlooked clue that was finally about to reveal what had really happened on the night of the storm. For the first time since Daniel disappeared, the investigation was no longer searching for a missing boy. It was searching for the people who had stolen his life. Retired Sheriff Thomas Whitaker stepped quietly into the Harper home. The room fell silent. Everyone in the valley knew him. For 11 years, he had carried the weight of one unanswered question. What had happened to Daniel Harper? Thomas removed his hat. His eyes rested on the young man sitting beside Margaret. For several seconds, he simply stared. The resemblance to the missing boy was impossible to ignore, not because he looked exactly the same, but because certain expressions had survived the passing years. The cautious smile, the way his eyes moved around the room, even the habit of tilting his head while listening. Thomas slowly extended his hand. My name is Thomas Whitaker. I was the sheriff who searched for you. David stood. Their handshake was firm. Neither man knew what to say next. Finally, Thomas placed the old leather folder onto the dining table. I think it's time all of us looked at something together. He carefully opened the worn binder. Inside were hundreds of pages collected over more than a decade. Maps, photographs, witness interviews, search reports, weather records. Most had already been seen countless times by Daniel's parents. But Thomas wasn't interested in those. He reached near the bottom of the file, pulled out 3 forgotten witness statements. I missed these. Robert frowned. You've read those before. Thomas nodded. I did, but I asked the wrong questions. He placed the first statement on the table. A farmer had reported seeing an unfamiliar dark pickup truck parked beside Miller's Creek only minutes before the storm became severe. The second report came from a teenage newspaper carrier. She remembered the same truck leaving at unusually high speed, while everyone else was pulling over because of the heavy rain. The third report had always seemed unimportant. A gas station attendant remembered serving fuel to a nervous middle-aged couple traveling with a frightened little boy who refused to answer when spoken to. At the time, investigators assumed there had been another family escaping the approaching storm. No one connected the reports. Thomas quietly folded his hands. Today, they tell a very different story. David leaned closer. His heartbeat quickened. The sheriff slid an old county map across the table. He marked each witness location with a pencil. The 3 sightings formed almost a straight line leading away from Miller's Creek. Robert stared silently at the map. So, you think someone took him? Thomas slowly nodded. I think the storm distracted everyone. While every search team focused on the river, someone may already have been driving him out of the county. The room became perfectly still. Margaret covered her mouth. For years, she had feared the river had taken her son. Now, a far more disturbing possibility stood before her. Someone had stolen him. David felt his stomach tighten. Fragments of memory began surfacing once again. Rain striking metal, a truck door slamming, a rough blanket covering his legs, someone saying, everything will be all right. Then, darkness. He pressed both hands against his temples. I remember. Everyone looked toward him. It was a truck. His voice shook. I couldn't see outside. I remember crying. And he stopped. His breathing became uneven. There was a woman. Margaret gently reached for his hand. You don't have to rush. Thomas quietly closed the folder. No, he should stop. Everyone looked at him. Memory doesn't return all at once. It comes in pieces. If we force it, We risk confusing real memories with imagined ones. David nodded. He understood. For the first time, someone wasn't demanding answers from him. Instead, they were allowing the truth to arrive naturally. Outside, evening settled over the valley. The same valley that had spent 11 years believing a little boy had been lost to the storm. Now, for the first time, it appeared the storm had only hidden a crime. And somewhere beyond the county line, the people responsible still had no idea that the child they had stolen had finally found his way home. The following morning, Thomas Whitaker drove back to the sheriff's office. Although he had retired years earlier, the current sheriff had gladly reopened the archives after hearing about David's arrival. What had once seemed impossible was now impossible to ignore. If David truly was Daniel Harper, then someone had committed a crime that had remained hidden for more than a decade. Thomas sat alone inside the records room. Stacks of faded folders surrounded him. He wasn't searching for Daniel anymore. He was searching for the people who had taken him. Hour after hour, he reviewed forgotten reports. Most led nowhere. False sightings, anonymous phone calls, unverified rumors. Then, almost by accident, he found a receipt clipped to the back of one witness statement. It came from a small roadside gas station located nearly 60 miles east of Miller's Creek. The date matched the night of the storm. The station owner had written something by hand in the margin before giving it to investigators years earlier. Dark blue Ford pickup. Thomas immediately remembered the vehicle described by the farmer. He requested every available registration from that period. The process took hours. Most records had already been transferred to storage. Some had even been preserved on microfilm. Late that afternoon, one registration caught his attention. A dark blue Ford pickup, owned by a married couple, Richard and Helen Brooks. Temporary residence. No children. No permanent address. Thomas continued reading. Just 6 months after Daniel disappeared, the couple had quietly left the county. No forwarding address. No employment records. Nothing. Almost as though they had intentionally disappeared. He leaned back in his chair. The coincidence was becoming difficult to dismiss. Meanwhile, back at the Harper farmhouse, David wandered through the property alone. Everything around him awakened emotions that words could barely describe. He stopped beside the old oak tree. The wooden swing still hung from the same thick branch. Its ropes had been replaced several times over the years, but the wooden seat remained original. David carefully reached out and touched it. His fingers froze. Another memory surfaced. A little boy laughing, his father pushing the swing, his mother waving from the porch. Then, pain. He remembered falling, his forehead striking a rock beneath the tree. Warm blood running down his face. Margaret carrying him inside. David instinctively touched the scar above his eyebrow. The memory felt real, not imagined. Real. He slowly sat on the swing. It creaked softly beneath his weight. For several minutes, he simply listened to the wind moving through the leaves. The place felt familiar in a way that frightened him, not because he fully remembered it, but because his heart did. Across the yard, Margaret watched quietly from the kitchen window. Robert stepped beside her. He remembers. Margaret nodded without taking her eyes off David. Little by little, Robert spoke softly. I've prayed for this day every night. She reached for his hand. So have I. Neither of them noticed a patrol car entering the driveway. Thomas stepped out carrying another folder. His expression was different this time, more serious, more determined. Robert met him halfway across the yard. You found something. Thomas nodded. I think I found the people. Silence settled between them. The words felt almost too heavy to believe. The couple who owned the pickup disappeared shortly after Daniel vanished. They left without telling anyone. They never returned. Robert stared toward David sitting beneath the oak tree. His voice barely rose above a whisper. If they took him, then they stole 11 years of his life. Thomas slowly closed the folder. I'm afraid it may have been much longer than that. For the first time since reopening the investigation, the mystery finally had names. Richard Brooks, Helen Brooks. But discovering who they were would prove far easier. then discovering why they had chosen one little boy. On one stormy night, the investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Modern technology had changed many things since Daniel disappeared. Old paper records had been digitized. Property files had been archived. Census information could now be searched within minutes instead of weeks. Yet some mysteries still refused to surrender easily. Thomas Whitaker sat beside Detective Laura Bennett, the sheriff's newest investigator. She had been only a child when Daniel vanished. Now she was helping solve the county's oldest unsolved case. Together, they followed every trace left behind by Richard and Helen Brooks. Employment records, vehicle registrations, tax filings, hospital visits. The trail appeared to end several years after they left the valley. Then, Laura found something. Richard Brooks had died nearly 4 years earlier. A heart attack. A small town nearly 600 miles away. Helen Brooks had entered an assisted living facility shortly afterward. She was still alive. Thomas remained silent for several seconds. 11 years of unanswered questions. And now one of the two people who might know the truth was gone forever. But the other was still living. Back at the Harper farmhouse, David continued recovering fragments of memory. Not complete scenes, only pieces, like scattered pages from a book whose beginning had been torn away. He remembered a dog, a brown bicycle, the smell of fresh apple pie cooling on a kitchen window, his mother's laughter, his father's boots leaving muddy footprints across the porch. Each memory lasted only seconds, but every new fragment felt stronger than the last. Margaret never interrupted him. Whenever David paused to describe another image, she simply listened. Sometimes she smiled through tears. Sometimes she quietly confirmed details only Daniel could have known. Late that afternoon, Thomas returned. This time his expression carried something different. Hope. He gathered everyone around the dining table. I found Helen Brooks. David looked up immediately. The woman who raised me? Thomas nodded. We believe so. David's emotions became impossible to read. For 11 years, she had been the only mother he remembered. Now, everything he believed about his childhood had been turned upside down. Margaret noticed the conflict immediately. She gently placed her hand over his. You don't have to hate her. David looked surprised. I don't even know what I feel. She nodded. I understand. Love doesn't disappear just because the truth changes. Those words settled heavily over the room. Thomas quietly continued. There's something else. He opened another folder. We interviewed several neighbors from the town where Richard and Helen lived. What did they say? Robert asked. Thomas took a slow breath. Everyone believed David was their biological son. No one ever questioned it. They described Helen as protective, almost excessively protective. David lowered his eyes. He remembered. She had rarely allowed him to visit friends, rarely allowed sleepovers, rarely answered questions about his childhood. Whenever he became curious, she always changed the subject. At the time, he believed she was simply overprotective. Now, every memory carried a different meaning. Thomas folded his hands. I've arranged permission to speak with Helen. Silence filled the room. David stared through the window. Beyond the fields, storm clouds were once again gathering over the distant hills. Not dangerous ones, just ordinary summer clouds. Yet the sight still unsettled him. For years, storms had filled him with fear he could never explain. Perhaps tomorrow he would finally learn why. Because somewhere inside a quiet nursing home, an elderly woman had spent 11 years living with a secret, and after all this time, the truth had finally arrived at her door. The nursing home stood on a quiet hill overlooking a small lake. It was peaceful, far removed from the chaos that had begun during one violent storm 11 years earlier. Thomas Whitaker parked a patrol car beneath a row of maple trees. David sat silently beside him. Neither had spoken much during the drive. Each understood that the next conversation could change everything. Before entering the building, Thomas turned toward him. You don't have to do this. David stared through the windshield. I've spent my whole life not knowing who I was. If someone can finally tell me, I have to hear it. Inside, a nurse led them through a long hallway. Family photographs decorated the walls. Soft music drifted from a nearby recreation room. Everything felt calm, almost painfully ordinary. Finally, they stopped outside room 214. The nurse lowered her voice. Helen has good days and bad days. Some memories are perfectly clear. Others disappear. Thomas nodded. He gently knocked. A frail voice answered. Come in. Helen Brooks sat beside the window, wrapped in a light blanket. Her hair had turned completely white. Age had softened her face, but her eyes remained sharp. She smiled politely at the visitors, until she looked at David. The smile disappeared instantly. For several long seconds, she simply stared. Then her hands began trembling. No, she whispered. No. David felt his heartbeat pounding inside his chest. Helen slowly stood from her chair. Tears filled her eyes almost immediately. I knew, she whispered. I always knew this day would come. Thomas stepped forward. Helen, we're reopening the disappearance of Daniel Harper. She closed her eyes. I know. You know why we're here. She nodded once, very slowly, then looked toward David again. I'm sorry. The words barely escaped her lips. David remained frozen. He had imagined anger, arguments, denials. Instead, the first thing he heard was an apology. Helen sank back into her chair. For several moments, no one spoke. Finally, she began. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. Thomas quietly opened his notebook. What happened? Helen looked toward the rain, beginning to fall outside the window. It started with a storm. My husband saw the little boy walking alone near the creek. He stopped the truck. David listened without moving. He wanted to help. The rain was getting worse. He told the child he'd drive him home. She paused. Her breathing became uneven. But once Daniel got inside, my husband kept driving. Thomas frowned. You didn't stop him? Fresh tears rolled down Helen's face. I tried. I screamed. I begged him to turn around. But he wouldn't. David's hands slowly tightened. Why? Helen buried her face in trembling hands. Because we had lost our own son. The room fell silent. Our little boy had drowned a year before. My husband never recovered. He said, her voice broke completely. He said God had finally given us another chance. David closed his eyes. 1,000 emotions collided inside him. Confusion, sorrow, disbelief. Helen continued through tears. I wanted to take you back. Every single day. But Richard became terrified. He believed we'd both spend the rest of our lives in prison. So we kept moving. Town after town. Never staying long enough for anyone to ask questions. Thomas quietly asked, Did Daniel ever remember? Helen slowly nodded. At first, he cried every night. He called for his mother. He begged us to take him home. David's breathing became heavier. Very faint echoes stirred inside his memory. A dark bedroom. Crying. Someone saying, everything will be all right. Helen wiped away another tear. Eventually, the memories became fewer. And one day, he stopped asking. David lowered his head. For years, he had believed those missing memories had simply faded with time. Now he understood. Childhood had protected him the only way it knew how, by burying unbearable pain beneath silence. Helen looked directly into his eyes. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know one thing. I never stopped loving you. David remained silent. Love. It was the one thing that made the truth even more complicated. Because despite everything, he knew she wasn't lying. She had committed an unforgivable wrong. Yet somewhere inside that terrible mistake, there had also been genuine affection. The tragedy had never belonged to one family alone. It had destroyed two. Outside, rain tapped softly against the nursing home windows, almost like the distant echo of a storm that had changed every life in that room. The drive back to the valley was quieter than the journey to the nursing home. No one knew what to say. Thomas kept both hands on the steering wheel. David stared through the passenger window. Fields, barns, small towns. Everything passed in silence. Only a day earlier, he had believed he was searching for his identity. Now, he had found it, and discovered that it carried more pain than he had ever imagined. When they arrived at the Harper farmhouse, Margaret was waiting on the porch. She knew immediately, not because anyone had spoken, but because she saw the expression on David's face. He walked toward her slowly. She opened her arms. Without saying a single word, he embraced her. For the first time in 11 years, he allowed himself to cry without trying to hold back. Margaret held him exactly as she had when he was a frightened little boy. Some things, she realized, a mother never forgets. That evening, David asked his parents if they would walk with him. The three of them followed the narrow trail, leading toward Miller's Creek, the same path Daniel had taken on the afternoon he disappeared. The woods were peaceful now. Sunlight filtered gently through the trees. Birds moved from branch to branch. Nothing suggested that this quiet place had once been the center of one of the largest search operations in county history. When they reached the creek, David stopped. The flowing water immediately awakened another memory. Not complete, only fragments. He remembered standing beside the creek, holding a smooth stone. He remembered hearing thunder. He remembered turning around. Then, a blue pickup truck slowly pulled onto the roadside. His breathing became shallow. "My head." Margaret gently held his arm. "You don't have to force it." David closed his eyes. The memory continued by itself. A man smiling, asking if he needed a ride home before the storm became worse. Daniel hesitating, then climbing into the truck, because children trusted adults in those days, especially kind-looking adults. The truck drove away. At first, everything seemed normal. Then Daniel noticed they had passed the road leading home. He remembered asking, "We miss my house." No answer, only silence. Then rain, thunder, fear. The memory ended as suddenly as it had begun. David opened his eyes. Tears rolled silently down his face. "I remember getting into the truck." Thomas lowered his head. The final uncertainty had disappeared. Daniel had not wandered away. He had not drowned. He had not become lost. He had been taken. Margaret quietly looked across the creek. "I searched here every day." Her voice trembled. "I kept thinking, if I look one more time, I'd find you." David took her hand. "You never stopped looking." She smiled through tears. "No, I never stopped believing." The sun slowly began setting beyond the hills. Golden light reflected across the moving water. For the first time, the creek no longer felt like the place where everything had been lost. Instead, it had become the place where the truth had finally returned. As the three of them walked back toward the farmhouse, David noticed something lying beside the old trail, half buried beneath leaves. A rusted metal toy truck. Small, blue. He picked it up carefully. Margaret gasped softly. Robert smiled with disbelief. "You carried that everywhere." David turned the tiny truck over in his hands. The faded blue paint was barely visible, yet the instant his fingers touched it, one final childhood memory returned. He remembered dropping it while running toward the creek. He had cried because he couldn't find it. Now, 11 years later, it had been waiting quietly beneath the leaves, almost as though the valley itself had been waiting for Daniel to come home. News of Daniel Harper's return spread far beyond the valley. Within days, newspapers that had long forgotten the story published new headlines. Television crews returned to Willow Road. Reporters gathered outside the sheriff's office. For the first time in more than a decade, the forgotten case was making national news again. But inside the Harper family home, fame meant nothing. They were learning how to become a family again, and that was far more difficult than anyone outside could understand. David was no longer searching for his identity. He knew his real name. He knew where he belonged. But 11 years could not simply disappear. He had missed birthdays, Christmas mornings, family vacations, school graduations, the first fishing trip his father had always promised, the bedtime stories his mother never had the chance to finish. No court, no investigation could ever return those years. Meanwhile, the district attorney reopened the criminal investigation. Although Richard Brooks had died several years earlier, prosecutors reviewed every document connected to the case. Helen Brooks voluntarily provided a complete statement. She admitted everything. She described the storm, the pickup truck, the arguments with her husband, the constant fear of being discovered. She accepted responsibility without asking for sympathy. Many people expected Daniel to demand revenge. Instead, he surprised everyone. During one interview with investigators, he quietly said, "I don't want people to think this story is simple. They stole my childhood. That can never be forgiven. But hate won't give those years back." His words quickly appeared in newspapers across the country. Some readers agreed. Others believed Helen deserved the harshest punishment possible. The debate lasted for weeks. In the end, because of her age, her failing health, Richard's death, and extraordinary passage of time, the legal outcome was limited. The court formally recognized the kidnapping. The Harper family was officially reunited with their son. The historical record was corrected, and the truth, which had remained buried beneath one terrible storm, finally became part of history. One afternoon, David returned alone to the nursing home. The nurses quietly showed him into Helen's room. She looked surprised to see him. "I didn't think you'd come." David pulled a chair beside her bed. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "I came because I needed to say something." Helen slowly nodded. "You gave me a home. You gave me food. You cared for me." Tears immediately filled her eyes. "But," David continued gently, "you also took away another family. You took away my parents. You took away the life I was supposed to have." Helen lowered her head. "I know. I think about it every day." David took a slow breath. "I don't know if forgiveness is something that happens all at once. Maybe it's something people spend their lives learning." Helen quietly cried, "I don't deserve even that." David stood. As he reached the door, he turned back one final time. "I hope you find peace." Then he left, not because everything had been resolved, but because carrying bitterness forever would only allow the storm to continue living inside him. Outside, the afternoon sky was perfectly clear. For the first time in many years, David realized he was no longer afraid whenever distant thunder echoed across the horizon, because now he finally understood it had never been the storm that stole his childhood. It had been the choices of ordinary people, and ordinary choices can change countless lives forever. Months passed. The excitement surrounding Daniel Harper's return slowly faded from national headlines. Television crews packed their equipment. Newspapers found other stories. The world once again moved on, but inside the valley, nothing would ever be quite the same. For the first time in 11 years, laughter returned to the Harper farmhouse. It didn't happen overnight. There were awkward silences, unanswered questions, memories that surfaced unexpectedly. Some mornings, David instinctively reached for habits he had learned in another home. Other days, he caught himself calling Margaret Mrs. Harper before quietly correcting himself. Healing, they discovered, was not a single moment. It was 1,000 small moments. One evening, Margaret prepared Daniel's favorite apple pie using the same recipe she had followed when he was a little boy. She placed it on the kitchen table. Without saying anything, David took one bite. His eyes widened. "I know this." Margaret smiled softly. "You always ask for a second slice." Robert laughed. "And then you blamed the dog." For the first time, David laughed with them, not because he remembered every detail, but because something deep inside him finally felt safe enough to belong. As autumn arrived, the town council announced something unexpected. The walking trail beside Miller's Creek would be renamed, not to remember the tragedy, but to remember hope. A small wooden sign was placed near the old bridge. It read simply, "The Daniel Harper Memorial Trail," a reminder that hope should never disappear. On the day of its dedication, nearly the entire town gathered beside the creek. Many of those present had once searched these woods with flashlights during the terrible storm. Some had grown old. Some walked with canes now. Others brought grandchildren who knew the story only from their parents. Thomas Whitaker stood quietly near the back of the crowd. He never enjoyed public attention. When the mayor invited him to speak, he hesitated, then slowly approached the microphone. I've spent most of my life believing that every mystery has an answer. He paused. Daniel taught me something different. Sometimes, the answer isn't what matters most. Sometimes, it's refusing to stop looking. Silence settled across the crowd. Even the creek seemed quieter. Thomas looked toward David. For 11 years, this town searched for a little boy. What we didn't realize was that hope had been searching for us too. When the ceremony ended, families slowly returned home. Children once again played beside the creek, exactly as children always had. But now, parents watched a little more carefully, held small hands a little tighter. Storm clouds still passed over the valley every summer. Thunder still echoed through the hills. Yet fear no longer carried the same power, because every time dark clouds gathered, people remembered something far stronger than the storm itself. They remembered that miracles sometimes arrive years later, quietly, unexpectedly, with nothing more than a knock on an old wooden door. Years later, visitors walking to the quiet valley often stopped beside the small sign near Miller's Creek. Some had read about Daniel Harper's story. Others knew nothing about it. They simply admired the peaceful landscape, the gentle sound of flowing water, the towering oak trees, the birds singing overhead. Nothing about the place suggested that it had once been the center of heartbreak, uncertainty, and one of the most remarkable reunions the region had ever witnessed. History has a strange way of remembering events. It celebrates victories. It records wars. It honors famous names. But countless ordinary people quietly disappear between the pages. Their stories slowly fade, not because they mattered less, but because time keeps moving. Daniel Harper's story could easily have become one of those forgotten chapters. Another missing child, another unsolved case, another family left with questions that would never be answered. Instead, it became something else. A reminder that hope sometimes survives far longer than certainty. David eventually rebuilt his life in the valley, not because the past would be restored. It couldn't. There would always be birthdays he never celebrated with his real family, memories that would never fully return, photographs taken without him, Christmas mornings forever lost. Some wounds never disappear completely, but wounds are not the only things that remain. Love remains, patience remains, forgiveness, however difficult, remains. Margaret and Robert never tried to force the missing years back into place. They understood something many people never do. The young man standing before them was both Daniel and David. He carried two childhoods, one that had been stolen and another that had been lived. Accepting both became part of healing. Thomas Whitaker officially retired for the second and final time not long afterward, during his farewell gathering. Someone asked him which case he considered the most important of his entire career. He smiled quietly. It wasn't the one I solved the fastest. It was the one that taught me never to stop believing. Those words stayed with everyone who heard them, especially the younger deputies beginning their own careers. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive in days or months. Sometimes it takes years before quietly finding its way home. The old oak tree still stands today. Its branches are larger now, its roots even deeper. Children still play beneath its shade. The wooden swing has been replaced once more, yet every summer, when warm winds move gently through its leaves, older residents still remember the little boy who once laughed there, the boy everyone believed had disappeared forever, and the young man who eventually found his way back. Not because fate suddenly became kind, not because miracles happen every day, but because somewhere deep inside him, one forgotten memory refused to disappear. One newspaper clipping survived. One retired sheriff decided to look at an old case one more time. And one mother never stopped believing. Perhaps that is why stories like this deserve to be remembered, not because they are extraordinary, but because they remind us how fragile ordinary life truly is. One decision, one storm, one unexpected act of kindness or cruelty can echo across decades. History almost forgot Daniel Harper, but his story still reminds us of something deeply human. Hope is not measured by days or years. Hope survives for as long as someone is willing to leave the light on, waiting for the impossible knock that may one day come. Thank you for watching History Forgotten. If this forgotten story moved you, consider subscribing so that more remarkable stories, nearly erased by time, can continue to be remembered, because history isn't only made by famous people. Sometimes, history is simply the story of ordinary lives that refuse to be forgotten.